Hello and welcome to the COGIT podcast series. My name is Dr Richards and I'm the editorial director of COGIT. Today I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr Devorah Margolin, who is the Director of Strategic Initiatives and a Senior Research Fellow at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. Devorah has been the project manager for the ISIS Files project and a senior investigator with a National Counterterrorism Innovation, Technology and Education Center. Devorah was also a senior research analyst at our very own COGIT and played a key role in organizing our major COGIT conference in September 2018 and in the compilation of our Jihadist Terror volume. Devorah, welcome. Great to see you and to have you back again.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to be able to talk to you again.
Thank you. I wonder, Devorah, if I could begin by asking about your ISIS Files project. I gather that it entailed the study of over 15,000 pages of material left behind by ISIS in Iraq. I wonder if you'd perhaps give us an overview as to what that project was about, and perhaps more particularly, what do these documents tell us about ISIS?
Absolutely. I think this was such a wonderful project, and it was actually the project that brought me to George Washington University and the program on extremism. I think as a researcher, we always want to be able to work with a collection of primary source documents and to be the first people to work with a collection such as this. And I feel extremely grateful for this opportunity. As you mentioned, it was a collection of 15,000 pages of primary source Islamic State documents collected from around Mosul area by the New York Times in between about 2016 and 2017. In 2018, we partnered with the New York Times at George Washington University. We digitized these files and the files were immediately returned. The original documents were immediately returned to the government of Iraq. So we do not hold any of the original files, just digital copies. And I think, it's really interesting. This project has been a collaboration between us at the Program on Extremism, subject matter experts, as well as the GW Library and Academic Innovation, who have a really great history of archival work. And I think what was interesting about this project was the ethical implications that came about. Often, this isn't discussed enough, the ethical issues surrounding primary source documents, that this includes information on both victims and perpetrators. And what we did was we took about 18 months of time to research and consult with over 300 institutions, experts, community stakeholders, before even beginning to kind of jump into this project. And while a very slow process, it was also a very vital process, and we were excited to launch it online in June of 2020. But it's still an ongoing process. These documents are still all fully translated, but we're really working on the redaction and kind of ethical issues regarding the release of different batches of these documents. To date, we've released 13 analytical reports looking at these different issues. And we kind of divided it into different ministries or government bodies that the Islamic State was operating in this area and found in the files. And I think the most interesting part about this is that these documents really provide a snapshot of life in Mosul under the Islamic State. Often as researchers, we look at propaganda, or we're often able to talk to victims or even perpetrators of such actions, but we are very rarely able to look at administrative documents. And they really tell us a lot about not only the people who implemented these documents, but the people whose lives were affected by these documents. And I think it's interesting because it's very rare you get to see this top-down ideological, guidance coming from the top of the organization, but also kind of the day-to-day, I would almost say nitpickiness of whoever's implementing it themselves, their own personal issues that they're dealing with, or the little notes written on the side of documents or textbooks. And I think that top down and bottom up, lens is really, really interesting that these files offer. I myself got to co-author two of the reports that were actually three, one looking at kind of the general introduction of it, as well as two of the reports looking at agriculture and the other one looking at women. And I think the really interesting part for me as a researcher when I was looking at these documents was, in the agriculture, we got to see a little bit of the evolution of decision making. I think sometimes we'll talk about the Islamic State as if it is a unified body that kind of made a decision in 2014 that implemented all the way through 2017, and nothing changed in that process. But it was really interesting to see in these files and these administrative documents that certain decisions regarding agriculture were made in 2014, and then decisions then evolved in 2015 and again in 2016. And we could see that throughout each year and each season. And a lot of it was affected by external factors as well, how ISIS was being affected by the international community. The other thing that I got to work on again was this paper on women's lives under the Islamic State. And this was, very fascinating and often under discussed. Often when we're talking about, a group like the Islamic State, or even the administration or governance of these groups, we often talk about them in a gender neutral sense, but the experiences of men and women under these groups are very, very different. And also the in-group and the out-group for these groups are very, very different. And what these documents allowed us to see is how women experienced life under the Islamic State throughout all of these documents. It wasn't just like there was a batch of documents just for women. Women were splattered in throughout all of these files, from Hizbah to agriculture to real estate and land taxes, how these women experienced life under the Islamic State. And it really provided a fascinating lens into kind of the group's top-down ideology, as well as the actual implementation of that ideology, and often the contradictions that arose in that process.
Well, that's fascinating. Thanks very much, Devorah. Did you get a sense from the documents that, Islamic State as a quasi-state, did it actually work in terms of administration, for example, or did you get a sense from the documents that it was pretty chaotic?
I think that people will be shocked to know that a lot of it was actually, pretty organized. And part of that came about due to the Islamic State's administrative strategy. They took over institutions that were already in place. Some really great research on rebel governance. What, allows for rebel governance to be successful is often, out-governing the government. And so what they were able to do is they were able to come in, take, institutions that were already there. I remember we had images of grain silos or other kind of administrative bodies where they just slapped their logo on it and said, look what we built. And they didn't build it, it was already in existence. But what they did is they took these institutions, they fired everyone who was part of the out group, i.e., anyone who they deemed not to be part of their in-group, which is quite broad, right? That's anyone who's not a Sunni Muslim who adheres to their values. So they basically sent either everyone home or killed, depending on how they defined that out group, and told people who they believed should be part of their in-group, you show up to work or we will kill you and your families. And that is a pretty great motivating factor to get people to show up to work. And what they did is they then used these institutions that were already in place to, carry out their administration. I think one interesting thing that we came across was, there is, once you become the governing actor, you always have to deal with kind of how do you achieve this internal legitimacy with local populations. And I think, the Islamic State was never interested in international legitimacy. That wasn't part of it. And they weren't even necessarily ideologically interested in internal legitimacy, right? They weren't necessarily, the ideology doesn't say, oh, we need these people to like us. The ideology says, this is the rules, follow it. But what we saw in the administration of their kind of governance was that they were interested in being perceived as legitimate among local populations. They talked about people who praised them for their proper governance, or there was an incident in which somebody who was one of their administrators was caught not following the rules, and they properly punished that person in front of local audiences, because they wanted people to, even if you believe ideologically follow this or there's repercussions, you don't necessarily want to have to carry out those repercussions. You want people to oblige. And so they were really interested in that internal legitimacy and compliance. And I think that's something that was kind of fascinating to think about. And often it was sometimes in contradiction to the ideology. So in the agricultural, we found, according to Islam, you're not allowed to fix prices. But they did fix prices because otherwise there would be major inflation and they didn't want to have to deal with that. And so there was really these contradictions that came out in the administration as well, which very much, I think, surprised me with how they confronted and addressed and moved forward with those issues.
Well, that's interesting. So there was a degree of pragmatism in the sense then.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned ethical issues a short while ago in terms of releasing the material. I wonder if you could outline perhaps what some of the sort of key ethical challenges that you faced during this project.
Yeah, I think it's really, again, we kind of went in as academic researchers on terrorism, right, and political violence. And I think one of the great parts about partnering with the library is how they view archives is very different than how we view archives. And I think we got to speak to, like I said, over 300 different institutions, individuals, community members who all were stakeholders in this. And I think as researchers, we go in and say, this is how people are going to use this archive. But I think being able to talk to so many different people, how archives are actually used is very different. And one of the most interesting groups we got to speak to were Holocaust archivists, who spoke about how they perceived Holocaust archives to be used was probably going to be mostly by academics. And in the end, they found that their biggest clients in these archives were actually the surviving families of these individuals who wanted this information to learn about their family history. And so how they had created their archive versus how it was used was very different. And so one of the things we really thought about was there are definitely a lot of ethical issues. These documents include information not only about the perpetrators of these crimes, but also the victims of these crimes, who are often still living in these communities, alongside some people who were perhaps willing collaborators or unwilling collaborators. I think that's also something that's very important to emphasize. There is a difference between somebody who left their home in, let's say, the United States, traveled to join the Islamic State, carried out crimes there, versus somebody who was living in Iraq and was not able to flee, perhaps for many, many different reasons, and was forced to comply with a system. And again, I'm not saying that an individual who willingly took part as, an Iraqi member of the Hizbah is the same thing as an Iraqi farmer who's farming their land in order to survive. And I think these are really important clarifications. And so we made a decision that for now, all personally identifiable information would be redacted. So that's all full names, birthdays. We left years, so you can have an understanding of an age. We left small towns and villages. So if it's a big city, again, we left, the city of Mosul or, Tel Afar, these kind of bigger areas. But we really redacted anything that could possibly give away any personal information. I remember even, and this is ongoing too. So once the documents are fully redacted, we again read them to see if we could find out any information. So I remember even just last week, I looked at a document and we had a prison name listed. So we decided to actually redact the name of the prison and say the individual was imprisoned, but not where, right? Because maybe somebody from this one city knew that there was one person in that prison. And so these are really, I know it almost seems a little bit nitpicky, but it's about protecting individuals and trying to think not only about the direct ramifications, but the secondary and tertiary ramifications as well, and long-term. Yeah. One thing we did leave, which I do think is kind of interesting, is that so any high known IS member, we left their name, especially if they were dead. And then a lot of these administrators were using kunyas or pseudonyms for themselves. And so we often left the first part of the pseudonym, not the full pseudonym, but for example, it would say Abu A. And part of that decision was so that individuals and researchers could see that it was the same person working on all documents. And so we do want to show some of this consistency. Another issue, again, personal to me, was that if you redact a name, you can't necessarily tell the gender of the individual. And so a big thing that we've done is we've added footnotes if an individual is a woman or a minor, and that's not necessarily identified in the information that was given. Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And thanks very much for sharing those thoughts on what looks like a fantastic project. Thanks for that, Devorah.
Slight change in tack. You also co-wrote a piece recently for the Washington Post, in which you stated that your own research had identified some blind spots that leave many Islamic State affiliated families in some kind of limbo. And I guess this is in the general context around repatriation of so-called foreign fighters. I wonder if you could outline what these blind spots are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I, along with my colleague as Haroro Ingram and Austin Doctor, were lucky enough to win a Department of Homeland Security grant looking at questions surrounding best practices for repatriation and reintegration. And this was, we won this starting in July of 2021. And so we've kind of been in the first aspect of this project, the first quarter of what we'll call a 2-year project. And this was looking at kind of what do we know about the foreign fighter problem, but specifically focusing on aspects of what Department of Homeland Security is emphasizing, spouses and minors. So specifically what this refers to, of course, is women and children. And one of the aspects we did is we really did a literature review of what is out there on foreign fighters. And what we found is that it is often compounded by what we call age and gender-based biases, right? Even the term foreign fighter is a gendered term. It assumes frontline fighting. If you understand the ideology of a group like this, you also understand that often that means military age men, so men over the age of, let's say, it depends, 18 and above, but even younger in some cases as well. And that doesn't mean that minors or women do not play a role within these groups, but it almost misunderstands these roles. And so what we were focusing on in this paper was this idea of these knowledge gaps related to age and gender-based blind spots. And a lot of these kind of blind spots focus on the foreign fighter family, as we call it, within the life cycle. So in the pre-departure, in theater experiences, as well as return. And we identified 3 major kind of blind spots. The first is the interconnectivity of families affiliated with the Islamic State. If you are solely focusing on fighters, you're really misunderstanding the Islamic State's what we call the whole of family approach, this idea of the active recruitment of men, women, and children into these groups. But this lens also really kind of misunderstands the kind of what we call the blurred lines between women's agency in joining these groups and their victimhood and culpability while under the Islamic State, and how that can often be blurred. I think a really interesting case is here in the United States, Samantha al-Hassani. She was a woman who actively helped her whole family, her husband, and well as minor children, travel to the Islamic State, helped fundraise the activities. But while in the Islamic State, had certain misgivings about experiences when she was there. She was unable to leave. And when she finally was able to return, what was really interesting was that, her husband had, and the family as a whole, had several minor slaves that were living with them. And these minors testified that, she helped defend them from her husband. And so again, there was agency, but there was also this really blurred line between culpability, owning a slave, but also defending those children. And so really understanding women's experiences is misunderstood when we're talking about the nuances of this. The other issue that we had in this interconnectivities of families is the kind of little attention is paid to minors, their experiences in trauma and transit. And in fact, we found that often minors aren't even counted, right? When we look at who's traveling, it's usually focused on either men or if sometimes women. There was a really great study by Joanna Cook and Gina Vale that tracked women and children, but really that was the first study of its kind to kind of disaggregate who was going. And I think that's really important. The second main issue in that knowledge gap is those pathways for return. We in the West often focus on these formal pathways, what we call repatriation. That is when a government will come in and bring individuals back. For example, here in the US, we talk often about this 28 number, 28 individuals, 12 adults and 16 children have been repatriated. But there's also informal pathways. These are individuals who may or may not have left before the fall of the caliphate or even after the fall of the caliphate, who returned on their own accord. And at the Program on Extremism, we were able to identify another 15 individuals who weren't included in that 28. And so we argue if you solely focus on formal pathways, you're going to be missing a whole big group of people. And the scope of the issue could be even larger than we first anticipate. And finally, the third issue in that blind spot is the consequences of long-term detention. Approximately 27,000 minors still remain in detention, foreign minors still remain in detention in Syria and Iraq. And there's humanitarian issues, this is, political instability, but there's no kind of cohesive plan in place. And I think when we think about, what sparked writing this article in the first place was the prison riots in Syria, and that there was foreign minors, some as young as 12, that were in these prisons, right? So there isn't a cohesive plan for how to deal with minors, and specifically minors who are aging up. And I would not say out, because I do not think 12 is aged out, but there's no cohesive plan. So a lot of these times when people are put into detention, women and children are separated from men. Men are sent to prisons, women and children are sent to indefinite detention. But one of the problems we see is that male children at some point are deemed a threat within these camps, and they are then sent to prisons. But there's no cohesive plan. It's not age 18, it's not even age 16. Like we said, there were some individuals as young as 12. And I think this is just such a blind spot, that who decides that this child is enough of a threat that they need to be with adult men rather than alongside their mothers still. So, I think that these are the three main issues we see, and we see them as very gendered and age-based biases that need to be addressed in order to kind of create a cohesive plan.
Absolutely, and thanks again for sharing those blind spots with us. Devorah, you've also made some really interesting observations on the role of women in the Capitol Hill riots. And I quote a piece you wrote for Insights about a year ago, I think it was, where you state that women's social media presence before, during, and after the Capitol Hill siege shows that they not only took part in, but organized, led, and claimed ownership for the events of that day. I wonder if you could provide some further detail on this, and in particular around the sort of leadership and these claims of ownership.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually that was a GNet piece for ICSR, GNet at ICSR. Yes. So I actually have a new piece coming out along with Hilary Matfis next week that will be looking at this. And it began as that initial GNet piece, right? We saw a really big presence on social media. We saw women among the crowds. And, there's been some really great work on women and the far right. Kathleen Blee, Kathleen Ballou, Cynthia Miller-Idris have all worked on this kind of very understudied aspect of the far right. I think something that's interesting to me is very similar to a violent Islamist ideology. Far right ideologies often hold very misogynistic, gender segregated views of men and women, men in public facing roles and women in private facing roles. But I think that often if we focus solely on public facing roles, we often miss women's very vital contributions to these ideologies. And that was part of what drove this paper that I'm working on with Hilary Matfis. And what we did is we looked at the cases brought to date between January 6, 2021 and March 15th, 2022. So just 2 weeks ago. And what we did is we had 766 cases, 102 involving women, so about 13%. And at the Program on Extremism, one thing that we've done is we've kind of created different categories of participation. That could be militant networks that carried out acts of violence or plan to carry out acts of violence. That could be spontaneous clusters. That is almost what we would call the crazy mob mentality, right? People get together and just become violent together. There was organized clusters, which is where women were, we actively saw kind of women create these non-violent but organized participation. So I think about that Super Happy Fun America group that was organized by a number of women who brought individuals to the Capitol that day. And then what we call the inspired believers, non-violent individuals who kind of fall into certain ideological far-right movements, be it QAnon or other conspiracy theories, who were there that day. And it was really, an interesting study into how do the events of January 6th, how can we understand them, but also how can we understand them within the larger kind of contextualization of women within the far right? Because as I mentioned, within the far right, we often see women in these auxiliary roles rather than these public facing roles. But I think one thing that's really interesting and that Hillary and I spoke about, as well as what Chelsea and I spoke about in that GNet article, is that social media has played a very interesting role for women. 82% of the cases that we looked at in this report that's coming out included women's connection to social media. So 82% of cases, women were posting about either before, during, or after the event about their participation. And I think what we have tried to emphasize is that social media provides women with an on-ramp as acting as spokespeople for these ideologies and far-right groups, and also kind of making their messaging more palatable to these mainstream audiences. And I think that's something that shouldn't be kind of underemphasized. I think another thing that we found was kind of a bit of a fissure or a kind of disagreement among far-right groups about what role should women play. And we have seen women taking on more kind of what we'd say public-facing roles. And there are some groups that still very much follow these misogynistic ideals. Think about the Proud Boys or some militia groups, or aspects of the alt-right in which women are supposed to be, traditional wives and mothers. But there's other organizations such as, the militia groups that are more about kind of gender, I wouldn't call it gender equality, but where women have taken on more public facing roles. And I think that is really interesting, where we've seen, the case of Jessica Watkins that should be coming to trial sometime soon. These are individuals who are taking these kind of public facing militaristic roles. And there's definitely kind of a fissure between these two parts of the far right movement, where there isn't an agreement about what roles should women play and how should those roles evolve.
Dr. Devorah Margolin, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your expertise with us. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Combating Jihadist Terror. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more episodes, they're available to watch on our website, cogit.org, or to listen to on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thanks again.